The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Bradley adjusted his red tunic one final time. The fabric felt heavier today, or maybe that was just him. 15 years of wearing this uniform. 15 years of standing perfectly still while the world moved around him. And some days it felt like he was carrying the weight of every single one of those moments. Thomas had always been proud of his position as a Queen's Guard. It wasn't just a job. It was an honor that few men ever experienced. Every morning when he put on that tall black bearskin hat and picked up his rifle, he was continuing a tradition that stretched back hundreds of years. He was protecting the royal family, serving his country, and representing everything that made Britain great. But pride doesn't pay the bills, and honor doesn't tuck your children into bed at night. The other guards were already taking their positions around the palace. Thomas knew each of them by name, knew their stories, their families, their struggles. There was Robert, whose wife had left him 2 years ago because she couldn't handle the long hours and rigid schedule. There was David, who hadn't seen his newborn daughter awake in 3 weeks because of his shift patterns. And there was William, the youngest of their group, who still believed that dedication alone would solve all of life's problems. Thomas envied William's optimism. He remembered feeling that way once back when he first joined the Guard. Back then he thought that serving the crown was the highest calling a man could have. He still believed that in many ways, but life had taught him that even the highest callings come with a price. The palace grounds were already bustling with activity. Tour guides were preparing for the day's visitors, maintenance workers were checking the barriers, and photographers were setting up their equipment for the changing of the guard ceremony. Thomas had performed this ceremony thousands of times, but today felt different somehow. Maybe it was the letter in his pocket, the one from the nursing home about his mother's condition getting worse. Maybe it was the phone call from his wife the night before. Her voice strained as she talked about their son's struggles at school, and how he needed his father around more. As Thomas walked to his post, he passed by the palace windows where he could sometimes catch glimpses of the royal family, going about their daily lives. It was strange, really, how close he was to them physically, but how distant they seemed from his world. They lived in the same building, breathed the same air, but their lives were as different as night and day. He had seen Prince George growing up over the years, watched him transform from a tiny baby being carried by his parents to the curious 8-year-old he was now. The young prince had a way of looking at people that was unusual for a child his age. While most kids his age were focused on games and toys, Prince George seemed to notice things that others missed. Thomas had seen him watching the guards sometimes, studying their faces with the kind of attention that suggested he was thinking about something deeper than just their colorful uniforms. The changing of the guard was scheduled for 11 o'clock, which gave Thomas 2 hours to stand perfectly still at his assigned post near the main entrance. 2 hours to think, to remember, to wonder if he had made the right choices in life. The tourists would start gathering soon, cameras ready to capture the spectacle of grown men in funny hats standing motionless while the world spun around them. Thomas took his position and assumed the stance that had become as natural as breathing, feet slightly apart, rifle held at the precise angle, eyes fixed on a point in the distance. His face became a mask of stone, revealing nothing of the man beneath the uniform. This was what people expected to see when they looked at a Queen's Guard. Not a human being with fears and doubts and family problems, but a symbol of strength and tradition. The first tourists of the day were already beginning to arrive. Thomas could hear them talking in various languages, pointing at him and the other guards, taking pictures. Some of them would try to make him laugh or react, not understanding that breaking character wasn't just against the rules. It was against everything he believed about duty and professionalism. A group of school children walked by with their teacher, all of them staring wide-eyed at the guards. One little girl asked her teacher why the soldiers never moved, and the teacher explained that they were protecting the Queen and had to stay very still to do their job properly. Thomas wanted to smile at the child's innocent question, but his training kept his expression neutral. The morning sun climbed higher, and Thomas felt the familiar ache in his legs that came from standing motionless for long periods. His body had adapted to this over the years, but it never became truly comfortable. The uniform, which looked so impressive to observers, was actually quite heavy and warm. On summer days like this one, sweat would build up under the bearskin hat, trickling down his forehead but never acknowledged. As the crowd grew larger, Thomas's mind began to wander to his family back home. His wife Jenny worked as a nurse at the local hospital, pulling long shifts to help make ends meet while he was away at the palace. Their daughter Lucy was 12 now, old enough to understand why her father missed so many important events in her life, but still young enough to feel hurt by his absence. Their son Charlie was only 8, the same age as Prince George, and he still asked when Daddy would be home for dinner again. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that he spent his days protecting someone else's children, while struggling to be present for his own. He knew Jenny was doing her best to hold everything together at home, but he could hear the exhaustion in her voice during their phone calls. She never complained directly about his job, but he could sense her frustration growing with each missed school play, each family gathering he couldn't attend, each time she had to handle a crisis alone because he was standing guard at the palace. The palace bells chimed 10 o'clock, signaling that he had 1 hour left before the changing of the guard ceremony. 1 more hour of standing perfectly still while his thoughts raced in circles, thinking about his mother's dementia getting worse, thinking about the bills piling up at home, thinking about whether his children would remember him as a father who was present in their lives or just a man in a red coat who was always somewhere else when they needed him. Warm breeze stirred the flags above the palace, and Thomas caught a glimpse of movement in one of the upper windows. For just a moment he thought he saw a small figure watching him from behind the glass, but when he focused his eyes on the spot, there was nothing there. Perhaps it was his imagination, or perhaps it was Prince George, observing the world around him with those thoughtful eyes that seemed to see more than most people expected from a child his age. The weight of the uniform felt heavier than usual today, but Thomas Bradley stood firm at his post, a silent guardian carrying burdens that no tourist would ever see behind his stoic expression. 23 years ago, Thomas Bradley was just another teenager from a small town in Yorkshire, dreaming of something bigger than the factory job that seemed to be waiting for him after school. His father worked in the same steel mill for 30 years, coming home every night with dirty hands and a tired expression that spoke of dreams that had been slowly ground down by the reality of paying bills and raising a family. Thomas didn't want that life. He wanted adventure, purpose, something that would make his mother proud when she talked to the neighbors. When the military recruiter came to his school, speaking about honor and service and the chance to be part of something truly special, Thomas knew he had found his calling. Basic training was brutal. The drill sergeant seemed determined to break down every young man who walked through their doors, only to build them back up into something stronger. Thomas discovered he had a natural ability to remain calm under pressure, to follow orders without question, and to maintain his composure even when everything around him was chaos. These qualities caught the attention of his commanding officers, who eventually suggested he apply for the Queen's Guard. The selection process was intense. Only the best soldiers were chosen to serve in this elite unit, men who could represent the crown with dignity and perform their duties with absolute precision. When Thomas received word that he had been accepted, he felt like he had won the lottery. His parents were bursting with pride, and his girlfriend Jenny couldn't stop talking about how handsome he looked in his dress uniform. The early years were everything Thomas had hoped for. He was stationed at some of the most important locations in Britain, protecting members of the royal family and participating in ceremonies that were broadcast around the world. When he married Jenny, they honeymooned in Scotland, and he felt like the luckiest man alive. He had a beautiful wife, a job he loved, and a future that seemed bright with possibility. But military life is demanding in ways that young men don't always understand when they first sign up. The rigid schedules meant that Thomas missed Christmas morning with Jenny 3 years running. When Lucy was born, he was standing guard at Windsor Castle, learning about his daughter's arrival through a brief phone call during his break. When Charlie came along 2 years later, Thomas was deployed for special security duty and didn't meet his son until the baby was 6 weeks old. Jenny tried to be understanding. She knew when she married a guardsman that their life would be different from other couples. She attended military wives' support groups and made friends with other women who understood the challenges of being married to someone whose first loyalty was to duty and country. But understanding something intellectually and living with it emotionally are two very different things. The first real crisis came when Lucy was 5 years old and had to go to the hospital for emergency surgery. Thomas was on duty during a state visit and couldn't leave his post. Jenny sat alone in the waiting room for 6 hours, calling Thomas every hour with updates that he could barely acknowledge because he was surrounded by dignitaries and protocol officers. By the time he finally made it to the hospital, Lucy was out of surgery and asking why Daddy hadn't been there when she was scared. That night, Jenny cried for the first time since their wedding day. Not the quiet tears of frustration or loneliness that Thomas had occasionally witnessed, but deep, painful sobs that shook her whole body. She didn't blame him directly, but she asked a question that would haunt him for years. When did protecting other people's families become more important than protecting our own? Thomas tried to explain about duty and honor and service to something greater than himself, but the words felt hollow in the face of his wife's pain. He loved his job, loved the pride he felt when he put on his uniform, loved being part of an institution that had protected the monarchy for centuries, but he also loved his family, and increasingly it felt like he was being forced to choose between the two. The financial pressures didn't help. Despite his years of service and specialized training, a guardsman's salary wasn't enough to support a family comfortably in modern Britain. Jenny had to work longer hours at the hospital to make up the difference, which meant even less time together as a family. The children learned to save their important news for the brief moments when Daddy was home, cramming weeks' worth of stories into hurried conversations before he had to leave again. Thomas's mother, Margaret, tried to be supportive, but he could see the worry in her eyes when she looked at Jenny and the children. Margaret had raised 5 children as a single mother when Thomas's father died young, and she understood better than anyone how hard it was to hold a family together when one parent was always absent. She never said anything directly, but Thomas knew she was concerned about the toll his career was taking on his wife and children. When Margaret's memory started to slip 3 years ago, it became another source of stress that Thomas felt powerless to address. Jenny was the one who noticed the signs first, the repeated questions and forgotten appointments. Jenny was the one who took Margaret to doctor's appointments and researched care facilities. Jenny was the one who held Thomas's mother's hand when the diagnosis of early-stage dementia was confirmed. Thomas wanted to be there for his mother, wanted to be the devoted son who helped her through this frightening transition, but his duties at the palace kept him away during most of the crisis points. He would arrive home to find Jenny exhausted from managing both his mother's care and their own children's needs, trying to balance everyone's requirements while he stood guard over people he had never met. The guilt was eating away at him. Every missed birthday, every school event where other fathers cheered for their children while Thomas stood motionless at his post, every phone call from Jenny asking for help that he couldn't provide because duty came first. He started having trouble sleeping, lying awake at night wondering if he had made a terrible mistake 15 years ago when he chose this path. His fellow guards understood the struggle because they were living it too. During their brief breaks, they would sometimes talk about the cost of their dedication. Robert's divorce had been finalized 6 months ago. David was seeing his children every other weekend now, awkward visits where he tried to catch up on weeks of missed moments in just a few hours. William, the young optimist, was starting to understand why the older guards sometimes had that distant look in their eyes. But there was pride too, real pride in what they did. When Thomas stood at attention during state ceremonies, when he protected visiting dignitaries, when he maintained his post through rain and heat and the endless hours of standing perfectly still, he was carrying on a tradition that meant something. He was part of something bigger than himself, something that would continue long after he was gone. The question that kept him awake at night was whether that pride was worth the price his family was paying, whether honor and duty could justify the growing distance between him and the people he loved most, whether serving the crown meant sacrificing everything else that made life meaningful. As Thomas stood at his post day after day, these thoughts circled through his mind like a storm that never quite passed. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, trying to serve both his country and his family, and discovering that sometimes the 2 demands were impossible to reconcile. Prince George had always been a curious child, but lately his curiosity had taken on a different quality. At 8 years old, he was old enough to move around the palace with some independence, especially when accompanied by his nanny, Miss Clare, who had been with the family since he was a baby. Unlike his younger siblings who were content to play with toys and chase each other through the long corridors, George found himself drawn to watching the people who worked in and around his home, There was something fascinating about the way the palace operated like a giant, complex machine. Hundreds of people worked there every day, each with their own important job to do. The cooks who prepared meals, the housekeepers who kept everything spotless, the gardeners who maintained the beautiful grounds, and of course, the guards who stood watch over everything and everyone. George had grown up seeing the guards as part of the landscape. Like the fountains or the grand staircases, they were always there, always in the same positions, always perfectly still and silent. But recently, he had started to notice them as individual people rather than just colorful statues in red uniforms. It started one rainy afternoon when George was looking out his bedroom window at the courtyard below. One of the guards was standing at his post near the main entrance, and the rain was coming down quite hard. George watched as the water dripped off the man's hat and ran down his face, but the guard never moved to wipe it away or seek shelter. He just stood there getting completely soaked as if the rain didn't exist. That night at dinner, George asked his father about the guards. "Papa, do they ever get cold or hungry or tired?" Prince William paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, surprised by the question. "Well, yes, I'm sure they do. They're people just like us. But they're very well trained and dedicated to their duty. But what happens if they need to use the bathroom?" George persisted, with the practical directness that only children possess. His mother, Princess Catherine, smiled at the question. "They have breaks, darling, and other guards take their places. They don't stand there all day without stopping." But George wasn't entirely satisfied with this answer. Over the next few days, he made a point of observing the guards more carefully during his walks around the palace. He noticed that while they did change positions periodically, they were never really off duty. Even during the changing of the guard ceremony, which George had watched dozens of times, the men maintained their serious expressions and precise movements. There was one guard in particular who caught George's attention. The man was taller than most of the others, with kind eyes that seemed sad even though his face never showed any emotion. George began to recognize him during his daily walks with Miss Clare, always in the same spot near the main entrance, always standing perfectly still with that same distant expression. "Miss Clare," George said one morning as they walked past the guard. "That man looks lonely." Miss Clare glanced at the guard, then back at George. "Lonely? He's working, Your Highness. The guards are very professional people who take their jobs seriously. But his eyes look sad," George insisted, "like when our dog Lupo was sick and couldn't play anymore." Miss Clare studied the guard more carefully, trying to see what George was seeing. To her, the man looked like every other guard she had seen over the years, stoic, professional, and completely focused on his duty. But she had learned that Prince George often noticed things that adults missed, probably because he approached the world without the assumptions and prejudices that came with age and experience. Perhaps he's just concentrating very hard on doing his job. "Well," she suggested gently. But George wasn't convinced. Over the following weeks, he made a point of walking past that particular guard's post every day. He noticed small details that others might miss. The way the man's shoulders seemed to slump slightly when he thought no one was looking. The way his eyes would sometimes focus on something far away, as if he was thinking about somewhere else entirely. One particularly hot summer day, George watched as sweat beaded on the guard's forehead and slowly trickled down his face. The man never moved to wipe it away, never acknowledged the discomfort, just stood there as still as a statue while the sun beat down on his heavy uniform. George found himself feeling sorry for the guard, imagining how uncomfortable and tired he must be. That evening, George brought up the subject again with his parents. "Mama, do you think the guards ever wish they could sit down?" Princess Catherine looked up from the book she was reading to Princess Charlotte. "I'm sure they do sometimes, darling. Standing for long periods must be quite tiring. Then why don't they?" George asked with the logical simplicity of a child who hadn't yet learned that the world often doesn't operate according to common sense. "Because it's their job," Prince William explained. "They're protecting our family and everyone who visits the palace. If they sat down or moved around, they couldn't do their job properly." George considered this for a moment. But who takes care of them? Who makes sure they're okay? The question caught both his parents off guard. It was such an innocent inquiry, but it revealed a level of empathy and concern that was remarkable for a child his age. Prince William and Princess Catherine exchanged a look, both realizing that their son was thinking about something that most adults never considered: the human cost of the service that surrounded them every day. "Well," Princess Catherine said slowly. They have supervisors and medical staff who look after them, and they have families who care about them. But George's next question was even more perceptive. Do their families miss them when they're here taking care of us? The silence that followed was telling. Prince William found himself thinking about the conversations he had occasionally overheard among the palace staff about the challenges of balancing work and family life. Princess Catherine thought about the guards' wives and children, people she had never met but who were affected every day by the dedication their husbands and fathers showed to the royal family. I imagine they do sometimes, Prince William admitted. Being a guard is a very important job, but it can be difficult for their families too. George absorbed this information with the seriousness that he brought to all his observations about the adult world. Over the next few days, he found himself paying even more attention to the guards, not just as protectors doing their job, but as real people with lives and feelings and families of their own. He began to notice other details, the way some guards had wedding rings, suggesting they had wives waiting for them at home. The way one guard had a small photo tucked inside his jacket pocket that he would glance at during brief moments when he thought no one was watching. The way they would sometimes exchange quick, knowing looks with each other. A silent communication between people who understood each other's struggles. But it was the tall guard with the sad eyes who continued to capture George's attention most strongly. There was something about the man's expression, visible even behind his professional composure, that suggested a deep weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. George found himself wondering what the guard was thinking about during those long hours of standing still, whether he was happy or worried or missing someone. The young prince had inherited his mother's intuitive understanding of people's emotions, combined with his father's sense of duty and responsibility. As he watched the guards day after day, he began to feel that someone should acknowledge what they were giving up to serve his family. Someone should let them know that their sacrifice was seen and appreciated. The idea that would eventually change everything was beginning to form in George's young mind, though he didn't yet know how to act on it. All he knew was that the man with the sad eyes deserved to know that someone cared about him, as more than just a colorful statue standing guard over the palace. It was during a quiet Sunday afternoon that Prince George finally found the right moment to have the conversation that had been building in his mind for weeks. The family was gathered in the private sitting room, a rare moment when his father wasn't buried in official papers and his mother wasn't rushing off to another engagement. Princess Charlotte was napping, and Prince Louis was playing quietly with his building blocks in the corner. George had been unusually thoughtful all morning, and Prince William had noticed his son's distracted behavior during their walk through the palace gardens earlier. Now, as they sat together reading, George closed his book and looked directly at his father with that serious expression that always indicated he was about to ask something important. "Papa," George began, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when he wanted to be taken seriously. "I've been thinking about the guards again." Prince William set down his own book and gave his son his full attention. Over the past few weeks, George had mentioned the guards several times, and each conversation had revealed a level of observation and empathy that both impressed and concerned his parents. "What about them, son?" "The tall one with the sad eyes," George said, as if this description would be enough for his father to know exactly which guard he meant. "I think he's been worried about something for a long time." Princess Catherine looked up from her correspondence, intrigued by the conversation. She had learned to pay attention when George made observations about people, because he often picked up on things that adults missed or chose to ignore. "What makes you think he's worried?" Prince William asked, genuinely curious about his son's perspective. George considered the question carefully, the way he always did when trying to explain something that seemed obvious to him, but might be harder for adults to understand. "His eyes look the same way yours do when you're thinking about something sad but trying not to show it. And sometimes when he thinks no one is looking, his shoulders get droopy like he's carrying something heavy." The accuracy of this observation struck both parents. Prince William found himself thinking about the emotional weight that came with public service, the way personal concerns had to be hidden behind a professional facade. It was a feeling he knew well from his own experience. "You know, George," Prince William said slowly, "being a guard is a very demanding job. These men have to stand for hours without moving in all kinds of weather while staying completely alert and focused. That takes a lot of strength and dedication. But what about their families? George asked, returning to the question that seemed to trouble him most. Do they get to see their children very much? The question hung in the air for a moment. Prince William found himself thinking about his own childhood, about the times his father had been away on royal duties, about the way public service could create distance even within families that understood its importance. Some of them probably don't get to spend as much time with their families as they would like, he admitted. Being a guard means putting duty first, sometimes even when it's difficult. George absorbed this information with the gravity of a child who was beginning to understand that the adult world was more complicated than he had previously realized. Do you think they ever feel lonely, even when they're surrounded by people all the time? The question revealed an understanding of human nature that was remarkable for someone so young. Princess Catherine felt a surge of pride in her son's emotional intelligence, combined with concern about the weight of the thoughts he was carrying. I think that's possible, she said gently. Sometimes the most difficult kind of loneliness is feeling alone even when you're surrounded by people, especially when you can't show your feelings or talk about what's bothering you. That's exactly what I think is happening with the sad-eyed guard, George said with conviction. He looks like he wants to tell someone something important, but he can't, because he has to keep standing still and being professional. Prince William felt a pang of recognition at his son's description. The isolation that came with duty, the weight of responsibility that couldn't be shared with others, the way personal struggles had to be kept private for the sake of maintaining a professional appearance. These were challenges he understood intimately. You know, George, he said thoughtfully, you've made me realize something important. Sometimes we get so focused on what people do for us that we forget to think about what it costs them to do it. George nodded eagerly, pleased that his father seemed to understand what he was trying to express. Do you think anyone ever tells the guards that they appreciate what they're doing? Not just the standing still part, but the missing their families part too? The question struck both parents as profoundly insightful. Official recognition focused on duty and service, but rarely acknowledged the personal sacrifices that made such service possible. The guards received medals and commendations for their professional performance, but who recognized the emotional toll of that performance? I'm not sure they hear that very often, Prince William admitted. Most people probably think about the guards the way we used to think about them, as symbols rather than as real people with real feelings and real families. That's sad, George said, with the simple directness that children use to cut through adult complexities. If someone was helping to take care of me and my family every day, I would want them to know that I noticed and that I cared about them. Princess Catherine reached over and ruffled her son's hair affectionately. You have a very kind heart, darling. It's wonderful that you think about other people's feelings this way. But George wasn't finished with his line of thinking. Papa, do you think it would be okay if I found a way to let the sad-eyed guard know that someone sees him? Not just as a guard, but as a person? The question caught Prince William off guard. His first instinct was to think about protocol and propriety, about the formal boundaries that existed between the royal family and the staff who served them. But looking at his son's earnest face, he found himself considering the deeper implications of the question. What did you have in mind? He asked, curious about how an 8-year-old would approach such a delicate situation. I don't know yet, George admitted, but I think he needs to know that someone notices when he's having a hard day. I think he needs to know that what he's doing matters to someone. Prince William felt a wave of emotion at his son's words. Here was a child who was learning to see beyond the surface of things, to recognize the humanity in people who were often treated as part of the scenery. It was exactly the kind of empathy and awareness that would make George a better future king. But more importantly, it was making him a better human being. I think, Prince William said carefully, that finding a way to show appreciation for someone's service and sacrifice is never wrong. But it would need to be done thoughtfully and respectfully. George's eyes lit up with excitement. So I could do something? Something small and quiet that wouldn't get him in trouble but would let him know that someone cares? Princess Catherine and Prince William exchanged a look over their son's head. They were both thinking about the same thing, that their 8-year-old had identified something important that they, as adults, had overlooked. The people who served their family with such dedication deserved to be seen and appreciated as complete human beings, not just as uniformed figures performing a function. I think, Princess Catherine said slowly, that if you came up with something appropriate and respectful, Something that showed genuine appreciation without disrupting anyone's work. That might be a very thoughtful gesture. George smiled for the first time all day, but it was a serious, determined smile rather than a playful one. He was already beginning to formulate a plan, something simple but meaningful, that would let the sad-eyed guard know that his service and his sacrifice had been noticed by someone who truly cared about his well-being. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of the sitting room, Prince George sat quietly with his parents, all three of them thinking about duty and service and the hidden costs of both. None of them could have predicted that this conversation would lead to a moment that would change everything for one lonely guard standing watch over their family. The morning of July 15th started like any other day for Thomas, but by evening it would become a date burned into his memory forever. He had received the call from the nursing home at 6 in the morning, just as he was preparing for his shift at the palace. His mother had taken a turn for the worse during the night, becoming confused and agitated, calling out for people who had been dead for decades. "She's asking for you, Mr. Bradley," the nurse had said gently. "She seems to think you're still a little boy. The doctor says these episodes can be very distressing for families, but there are also opportunities for connection if you can be here." Thomas had stared at his uniform hanging on the bedroom door, feeling the familiar tug between duty and family that had defined his adult life. He was scheduled for palace duty in 2 hours, and the changing of the guard ceremony was an important one today, with visiting dignitaries from 3 different countries in attendance. Missing his post would mean letting down his fellow guards and potentially compromising security arrangements that had been planned for weeks. But his mother was slipping away, piece by piece, and these moments of lucidity were becoming rarer. Each time he missed one of these opportunities to connect with her, he wondered if it might have been the last. Jenny had been awake too, standing in the doorway in her nurse's scrubs, getting ready for her own early shift at the hospital. She didn't say anything, but Thomas could see the pain in her eyes. They both knew what choice he would make, because they both knew that duty would win again just as it always did. "Go to her," Jenny had said quietly. "I'll call in sick and cover for you somehow." But Thomas had shaken his head, hating himself even as he did it. "I can't, love. Not today. The protocol officers would have my head, and we can't afford for me to lose this position." So he had kissed his wife goodbye, listened to her disappointed sigh, and driven to the palace with his mother's confused voice echoing in his head. By the time he took his position near the main entrance, the weight of guilt and regret felt heavier than his rifle. The day had dragged on with unusual difficulty. Every time Thomas tried to clear his mind and focus on his duties, he found himself thinking about his mother alone in that sterile nursing home room, wondering why her son hadn't come to see her when she needed him most. He thought about all the times he had chosen duty over family, all the moments he had missed that could never be recovered. By afternoon, a steady rain had begun to fall, but Thomas remained at his post, water dripping from his bearskin hat and soaking through his uniform. The tourist had mostly given up and headed for shelter, leaving the courtyard relatively quiet except for the occasional palace staff member hurrying between buildings. It was during this lull that Prince George appeared, walking with Miss Clare under a large umbrella. The young prince seemed to be taking his time, deliberately slowing his pace as they approached Thomas's position. Thomas had noticed the boy's increased attention over the past few weeks, the way he would pause during his walks to study the guards with those thoughtful eyes. Today, however, something was different. Prince George was carrying a small piece of paper in his hand, and he kept glancing at Thomas with an expression of nervous determination. As they drew closer, Thomas could see that the paper had been carefully folded and appeared to have something drawn on it in colored pencils. Miss Clare seemed unaware of the prince's intentions, focused on navigating the puddles that had formed in the courtyard. But Prince George had clearly planned this moment carefully. When they reached the point directly in front of Thomas's post, the young prince suddenly stopped walking. "Miss Clare," he said in his clear, polite voice, "I dropped something. Could you wait just a moment while I pick it up?" Without waiting for an answer, Prince George stepped away from the protection of the umbrella and approached Thomas's position. The rain immediately began soaking his jacket, but he didn't seem to notice or care. He looked up at Thomas with those serious, empathetic eyes that had been studying him for weeks. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the 8-year-old prince and the veteran guard who had been struggling with so much pain and guilt. Then very quietly, Prince George placed the folded paper at Thomas's feet and stepped back. "Thank you," the young prince said, in a voice so soft that only Thomas could hear it, "for keeping us safe when it costs you so much." Before Thomas could process what was happening, Prince George had returned to Miss Claire's side, allowing her to guide him toward the palace entrance. But as they walked away, Thomas caught the boy looking back at him with an expression of concern and kindness that took his breath away. Thomas forced himself to maintain his position, but his eyes were drawn downward to the small piece of paper at his feet. He could see just enough to make out that it was a drawing of some kind, created with the careful attention to detail that children bring to their most important projects. The rain continued to fall, and Thomas watched in horror as the edges of the paper began to curl and the colors started to run. The young prince had given him something precious, something that had clearly taken time and thought to create, and it was being destroyed by the weather. But Thomas couldn't move, couldn't break his stance to protect the gift, couldn't even acknowledge that he had received it. As the minutes passed, Thomas found himself in emotional agony. The drawing represented something he had never expected to receive. Recognition not just of his service, but of the personal cost of that service. Prince George had seen past the uniform in the ceremony to the man underneath, the man who was struggling with impossible choices and carrying burdens that no one else seemed to notice. But Thomas was trapped by the very duty that the prince had acknowledged. He couldn't move to save the drawing, couldn't even look down at it properly, couldn't do anything except stand perfectly still while this unexpected gift dissolved in the rain. The irony was devastating. He was losing this moment of connection because of the same rigid dedication that had earned him the recognition in the first place. The rain soaked through Thomas's uniform, mixing with tears that he couldn't wipe away. For 15 years he had stood at this post and others like it, maintaining perfect composure no matter what was happening in his personal life. He had stood still through physical pain, through emotional crises, through the knowledge that his family needed him while he served others. But this was different. This was a moment when someone had seen his struggle and responded with pure kindness, and he was powerless to properly receive that gift. The drawing at his feet represented everything he had sacrificed: time with his children, presence during family crises, the ability to be fully human instead of just a symbol in uniform. As the paper continued to disintegrate in the rain, Thomas felt something break inside him that had been held together by will and training for longer than he could remember. The weight of all those missed moments, all those choices between duty and love, all those times when he had been present in body, but absent in heart, came crashing down on him at once. The young prince had seen him as a person, had recognized his sacrifice, and had reached out with the simple generosity that only children possess. And Thomas couldn't even protect that precious gesture from the rain that was washing it away before his eyes. Standing there in his soaked uniform, unable to move or speak or even properly acknowledge the gift he had been given, Thomas Bradley finally understood the true cost of the life he had chosen. And for the first time in his 15-year career as a Queen's Guard, he began to cry. The tears came slowly at first, just a few drops that mixed with the rain already streaming down Thomas's face. Anyone watching from a distance might have mistaken them for rainwater, but Thomas knew the difference. These tears came from a place deep inside him that he had locked away years ago, a place where he kept all the emotions that weren't allowed to show on a guardsman's face. He tried to stop them, tried to summon the iron discipline that had carried him through 15 years of standing motionless in all weather and circumstances. But something fundamental had shifted inside him when Prince George placed that drawing at his feet. The young boy's simple act of recognition had opened a door that Thomas didn't know how to close again. The drawing was barely recognizable now, the colors running together in watercolor streams, but Thomas could still make out the basic shapes. It showed a guard, clearly meant to be him, standing tall and proud but surrounded by small hearts drawn in red crayon. At the bottom, in the careful handwriting of an 8-year-old, were words that had been partially washed away but were still legible. "Thank you for keeping us safe." But it was the second line, written in smaller letters, that broke Thomas completely. "I hope your family knows how brave you are." The innocent wisdom of those words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Here was a child who understood something that most adults never considered, that true bravery wasn't just standing still in the face of danger, but standing still while your heart broke for the people you couldn't be with. Prince George had somehow recognized that Thomas's greatest sacrifice wasn't the physical discomfort or the potential risks of his job, but the emotional cost of being separated from the people he loved most. Thomas's shoulders began to shake slightly, barely perceptible movements that would have been invisible to anyone, not specifically watching for them. The other guards at nearby positions could see that something was wrong, but they understood the unspoken code that governed their brotherhood. When one of them was struggling, the others quietly adjusted their vigilance to compensate, never acknowledging the crisis but always providing silent support. Robert, stationed near the main gate, had caught sight of Thomas's distress and subtly shifted his position to get a better view of the approaches to the palace. David, at the east entrance, had straightened his stance and increased his alertness to cover for any lapse in Thomas's attention. William, the youngest of their group, felt a mixture of concern and confusion as he watched his mentor battle emotions he had never seen displayed before. The rain continued to fall, and Thomas felt each drop like a reminder of his powerlessness. He couldn't move to protect the drawing, couldn't acknowledge the gift properly, couldn't even thank the young prince who had shown him such unexpected kindness. He was trapped by the very dedication that Prince George had sought to honor. As the minutes passed, Thomas's tears flowed more freely. 15 years of suppressed grief came pouring out. Grief for all the missed bedtime stories, for the Christmas mornings when he stood guard while his children opened presents, for the school plays where other fathers cheered while he maintained his post. He grieved for his mother's confused calls that he couldn't answer, for Jenny's tired sighs when he chose duty over family once again, for the growing distance between him and the children who barely knew their father. A small group of tourists had gathered under the colonnade, watching the guards with the casual interest that Thomas had grown accustomed to over the years. But today their presence felt intrusive, their cameras capturing what should have been a private moment of human vulnerability. Thomas wanted to scream at them to look away, to stop treating his pain as entertainment. But his voice was locked away behind years of training. One of the tourists, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, seemed to sense that something significant was happening. She lowered her camera and spoke quietly to her companions, suggesting they move on to give the guard some space. It was a small gesture, but Thomas felt grateful for her consideration even though he couldn't express it. The weight of his rifle seemed to increase with each passing minute, not because of its physical mass but because of what it represented. The weapon was a symbol of his oath, his commitment to protect others even at the cost of protecting himself. But today it felt like a burden that he could barely carry, a reminder of all the ways his dedication had isolated him from the life he wanted to live. Thomas thought about Jenny, probably at the hospital now, dealing with her own stresses while worrying about his mother, and wondering why her husband couldn't be present for the family crisis. He thought about Lucy, his 12-year-old daughter, who had stopped asking when Daddy would be home for dinner because she already knew the answer. He thought about Charlie, 8 years old like Prince George, who barely knew his father beyond the man who sometimes appeared in uniform and then disappeared again. Most painfully, he thought about his mother, Margaret, sitting alone in her nursing home room, probably still asking for the son who wouldn't come because duty called louder than love. The dementia was stealing her memories piece by piece, and each day Thomas missed was a day that could never be recovered. Soon she might not remember him at all, and his last opportunities to connect with her would be lost forever. The irony was crushing. Here he was, dedicating his life to protecting someone else's family while his own family slowly fragmented from his absence. Prince George, in his innocent wisdom, had recognized this paradox and tried to offer comfort, but Thomas was too bound by protocol to fully receive even that small kindness. As his tears continued to fall, Thomas became aware that other palace staff members were beginning to notice his distress. A maintenance worker had stopped his tasks and was watching with concern. One of the palace secretaries had paused on her way to a meeting, clearly debating whether to approach or summon help. But it was Miss Clare who first understood the full significance of what was happening. She had seen Prince George's determination that morning, had noticed the careful way he had prepared his drawing, and now she was witnessing its impact on the guard who had received it. She stood in the doorway of the palace, umbrella forgotten, watching as a man's composure cracked under the weight of kindness he couldn't properly acknowledge. The rain was beginning to lighten, but the damage to the drawing was complete. What had been a child's careful creation was now just soggy paper and running colors, barely recognizable as the gift it had been intended to be. But its message had been received, its impact felt in ways that Prince George could never have imagined. Thomas Bradley stood at his post, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding that some moments are too powerful to be contained by duty or discipline. The young prince's gesture had shown him that his sacrifice was seen and valued, but it had also revealed the true cost of that sacrifice in ways that made continuing to pay it seem almost impossible. For the first time in his career, Thomas wondered if honor and duty were worth the price his heart was paying. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he knew the answer. Word traveled through the palace with the quiet efficiency that characterized all communication within royal circles. Miss Clare had been the first to understand what she had witnessed, but she was also wise enough to know that such a delicate situation required careful handling. Rather than creating a scene or drawing unwanted attention to Thomas's emotional moment, she had quietly informed the palace security coordinator, who in turn spoke with the head of the guard unit. Within an hour, arrangements had been made for Thomas to be relieved of his duties for the remainder of the day. The official reason given was a minor medical issue requiring attention, but everyone involved understood the deeper truth. A good man had reached his breaking point, and the system that demanded his unwavering service also had a responsibility to care for him when that service became unbearable. The story of Prince George's drawing and Thomas's emotional response began to circulate through the palace staff with the kind of respectful discretion that protected everyone involved while acknowledging the significance of what had occurred. The housekeeping staff, who had seen the prince working carefully on his drawing for several days, understood that they had witnessed something special. The kitchen workers, who knew Thomas as a polite and dedicated man who never complained about his long shifts, felt a collective sympathy for his obvious pain. But it was the other guards who were most affected by what they had seen. Each of them recognized something of themselves in Thomas's breakdown, because each of them carried similar burdens. Robert thought about his failed marriage and the weekends when he saw his children struggling to reconnect with a father who felt like a stranger. David considered his own growing distance from his family and wondered if his dedication to duty was worth the price his loved ones were paying. Even young William began to question whether the pride he felt in his uniform was sufficient compensation for the sacrifices he was already being asked to make. The drawing itself, now a soggy mess of paper and running ink, had been carefully collected by one of the maintenance staff and dried as much as possible. Though barely legible, it was preserved as evidence of an extraordinary moment of human connection that had occurred within the formal protocols of palace life. By evening, the story had reached Princess Catherine, who immediately understood its deeper implications. As a mother herself, she was moved by her son's empathy and initiative, but she was also troubled by the revelation of how much the palace staff sacrificed for their family's security and comfort. She had grown up around royal protocol and understood the demands placed on those who served the crown. But Prince George's innocent observation had shown her this familiar world through fresh eyes. When she shared the story with Prince William that night, both parents found themselves grappling with questions they had never seriously considered before. How many of the people who served their family were struggling with similar conflicts between duty and personal life? How many were missing important moments with their own children in order to protect the royal children? How many were carrying burdens that remained invisible behind their professional demeanor? George saw something that we've been looking at every day but never really seeing, Princess Catherine said as they sat in their private sitting room. These men aren't just guards to him. They're people with families and feelings and struggles just like anyone else. Prince William nodded thoughtfully. I think our 8-year-old son has just taught us something important about leadership. Real leadership means caring about the whole person, not just their service to you. Their conversation continued late into the evening, touching on themes of service and sacrifice that went to the heart of what it meant to be part of the royal family. They talked about their own privileged position and the responsibility that came with being served by so many dedicated people. They discussed ways to better support the staff who gave so much of themselves to ensure the royal family's safety and comfort. Meanwhile, Thomas had gone home to face the conversation with Jenny that he had been avoiding for months. The emotional breakdown at the palace had stripped away his ability to pretend that everything was manageable, that he could continue to balance his competing loyalties without consequence. He found Jenny in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the efficient movements of someone who had learned to manage a household largely on her own. When she saw his face, still bearing the traces of his earlier tears, Jenny immediately stopped what she was doing and went to him. For the first time in years, Thomas didn't try to minimize his struggles or reassure her that he could handle everything. Instead, he told her about Prince George's drawing, about the way it had forced him to confront the cost of his choices, about the realization that he was losing his family while trying to serve his country. "I don't know how to do this anymore, Jen," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to be the husband and father you all need while still being the guard I swore to be." Jenny held him while he cried, feeling her own tears start as she realized that the emotional distance she had sensed growing between them had finally found its voice. They talked through the night about their marriage, their children, their dreams for the future, and the ways that Thomas's dedication to duty had gradually isolated him from the life they had built together. The next morning brought unexpected news. Thomas received a call from his commanding officer informing him that he had been granted extended leave to deal with family matters. The official paperwork cited personal circumstances requiring attention, but Thomas understood that this unexpected compassion was connected to the previous day's events at the palace. More surprisingly, the officer mentioned that there were discussions taking place about better support systems for the guards and their families, recognition that the current demands placed on the men were unsustainable for those with significant personal responsibilities. While no specific changes had been announced, it was clear that Thomas's visible struggle had prompted broader conversations about the human cost of royal service. The leave came at exactly the right moment. Thomas was able to spend 3 weeks with his mother, sitting by her bedside during the lucid moments when she recognized him, and holding her hand during the confused periods when she called him by his father's name. He helped Jenny with the household responsibilities he had been forced to neglect for years, attended Lucy's school concert for the first time since she was 8, and played catch with Charlie in the backyard while wearing civilian clothes that allowed him to move freely. During those weeks, Thomas began to understand what Prince George had seen that prompted the young boy's gesture of kindness. The prince had recognized a man who was disappearing behind his uniform, someone whose humanity was being slowly eroded by the relentless demands of duty without acknowledgement of personal cost. The drawing, now carefully preserved in a frame despite its weather damage, sat on Thomas's kitchen table as a reminder that his service had been truly seen by someone who understood its price. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the moment when an 8-year-old prince had shown more wisdom about leadership and compassion than many adults ever achieve, but the real gift hadn't been the drawing itself. It had been the permission to be human that came with it, the recognition that strength sometimes meant acknowledging weakness, and the understanding that true service to others must include care for oneself and one's own family. As Thomas prepared to return to his duties, he carried with him a new understanding of what it meant to serve with honor while remaining whole as a human being. The balance would still be difficult to maintain, but now he knew that the struggle itself was worthy of recognition and support. 3 months later, Thomas Bradley returned to his position at Buckingham Palace, but he was not the same man who had broken down in the rain that July afternoon. The extended leave had given him time to reconnect with his family, to care for his mother during her final weeks, and to rediscover parts of himself that had been buried beneath years of rigid duty. His mother had passed peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks into his leave, with Thomas holding her hand and Jenny sitting beside them both. For the first time in 15 years, Thomas had been present for a family crisis, able to provide comfort and support when it mattered most. Margaret's final lucid moment had been spent looking into her son's eyes and telling him how proud she was of the man he had become, but also how glad she was to see him learning to be a father and husband as well as a soldier. The funeral had been attended by several of Thomas's fellow guards, men who understood the significance of being able to properly honor a fallen comrade's family member. Their presence had meant more to Thomas than any official commendation, because it represented the brotherhood that sustained them all through the difficult demands of their service. When Thomas resumed his duties, he found that subtle but important changes had been implemented throughout the guard units. Scheduling had been adjusted to provide more flexibility for family emergencies. Counseling services had been made available for guards struggling with the emotional toll of their service. Most importantly, There was a new recognition that taking care of the guards' personal well-being was essential to maintaining the high standards of their professional performance. The changes hadn't come about overnight, and they weren't perfect solutions to all the challenges faced by military families, but they represented a shift in thinking that acknowledged the full humanity of the men who served the Crown, recognizing that their personal struggles and family responsibilities were not weaknesses to be overcome but realities that required support and understanding. Thomas's first day back at his familiar post near the main entrance was emotionally charged. As he took his position and assumed the stance that had become second nature over 15 years of service, he felt the weight of his uniform differently than before. It still represented duty and honor and service to something greater than himself, but now it also carried the memory of Prince George's kindness and the knowledge that his sacrifice was seen and valued by those he protected. The other guards welcomed him back with the understated warmth that characterized their professional relationships. No one mentioned his breakdown directly, but there were small gestures of support and understanding that let him know his brothers-in-arms had been concerned about him and were glad to have him back. Robert had saved several funny stories from his weekends with his children, sharing them during their brief breaks to help Thomas ease back into the rhythm of palace duty. David had brought extra tea and offered to share it during the long morning shifts. Even young William seemed more thoughtful and mature, as if witnessing Thomas's struggle had taught him important lessons about the realities of the career he had chosen. It was during his second week back that Thomas encountered Prince George again. The young prince was walking through the courtyard with Miss Clare, as he had done countless times before, but today he paused when he reached Thomas's position. For a moment, the guard and the prince looked at each other with the memory of their previous encounter hanging between them. Prince George had grown slightly taller in the month since their last meeting, and his face showed the increased maturity that comes with witnessing the impact of one's actions on another person's life. He had learned from his parents about Thomas's leave of absence and his mother's death, and he understood in his 8-year-old way that his small gesture had been part of something much larger and more significant than he had originally intended. "Good morning, Mr. Bradley," Prince George said quietly, using Thomas's name for the first time. The formality was appropriate for the public setting, but the personal recognition behind it was unmistakable. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Thomas replied, maintaining his professional demeanor while allowing just a hint of warmth to enter his voice. Prince George smiled then, not the polite smile he had been taught to use in public situations, but a genuine expression of happiness at seeing Thomas back at his post. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply before continuing on his walk with Miss Clare. Those 4 words, "I'm glad you're here," carried more meaning than any formal commendation Thomas had ever received. They represented recognition not just of his service, but of his value as a person whose presence mattered to the family he protected. Coming from the young prince who had shown him such unexpected kindness, they felt like a blessing and an affirmation that he had made the right choice in returning to his duties. Over the following weeks, Thomas settled into a new rhythm that balanced his professional responsibilities with his personal needs in ways that had seemed impossible before his breakdown. The extended leave had taught him that being a good guard didn't require sacrificing everything else that made life meaningful. In fact, taking care of his own well-being and maintaining strong relationships with his family made him more effective in his professional role, not less. Jenny noticed the change immediately. Thomas was more present during his time at home, more engaged with the children's daily lives, more willing to talk about the challenges and rewards of his work. The emotional walls that had gradually built up between them began to come down, as Thomas learned to share his struggles rather than carrying them alone. Lucy, now 13, started asking her father about his work in ways that showed she was beginning to understand the complexity of adult responsibilities. Charlie, at 9, began to see his father as a real person rather than just a uniformed figure who occasionally appeared at home. The family dinners that Thomas was now able to attend regularly became opportunities for genuine connection and conversation. The drawing that Prince George had given him, carefully preserved despite its water damage, hung in a frame in Thomas's study at home. It served as a daily reminder of the moment when everything changed, when a child's simple act of recognition had given him permission to be human while still serving with honor. Sometimes, during his long shifts at the palace, Thomas would catch sight of Prince George playing in the gardens or walking through the corridors, and he would feel a deep sense of gratitude for the young boy's wisdom and compassion. The prince was growing up to be exactly the kind of leader his country would need, someone who could see past the surface of protocol and ceremony to the real people whose lives were affected by royal decisions. As Thomas stood at his post, watching over the family that had inadvertently taught him so much about balance and humanity, he understood that true service wasn't about sacrificing everything for duty. It was about finding ways to honor your commitments while remaining whole as a person, about protecting others while also protecting what mattered most in your own life. The young prince had given him more than a drawing that rainy day in July. He had given him a new understanding of what it meant to serve with both strength and compassion, to maintain duty while embracing humanity, and to stand guard over others while also standing guard over his own heart. Thomas Bradley continued to serve as a Queen's Guard for many more years, but he did so as a complete person rather than just a man in uniform, and every day as he took his position and assumed his stance, he carried with him the memory of an 8-year-old prince who had seen him as a human being worthy of kindness and recognition. The quiet gesture had changed everything, not just for one guard, but for everyone who understood that true leadership means caring for the whole person, not just their service to you. In the end, it was a lesson that would serve Prince George well as he grew toward his own destiny, and a gift that would resonate through the palace long after both the guard and the prince had moved on to other chapters of their lives.